Hello, this is the Global Politics Podcast at the end of history. It's called Aufhebunga Bunga, and now it's party time. But this is a new kind of party. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the mass political party become the hegemonic form of civic political organization, interfacing between citizens and the state. But we all know what happened to it. It became a really crappy, hollowed-out shell. It became more interested in marketing than on participation, more focused on the politics of the corridor than on representing its base's interests. Dominated by pollsters and consultants, it's little surprise that membership of these organizations has dropped precipitously over the past decades. But something new has emerged, something that uses digital technologies to increase participation, bringing its members closer to power. Or so they claim. This is the platform or digital party. Our guest today, Paolo Gerbaudo, has written a book, The Digital Party, that explores this proposition. Paolo is a political sociologist and activist and lecturer at King's College London. He's also the director of the Centre for Digital Culture there. What you'll hear now is our interview with Paolo, which runs about 55 minutes, and then we round out at the end with a brief discussion amongst ourselves, drawing out the key themes. Quick reminder before we get started, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast. Please chip in some money if you feel we're worth it. It'll go towards expanding our output. And remember to rate and review us on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you can give us those tasty gold stars. Cheers. All right, welcome everyone to Aufhebunga Bunga. We are Ben Fogel in São Paulo, George Hoare in the UK, and Phil Cunliffe in the UK, and myself in São Paulo. I'm Alex Hochuli, and we're very happy to be joined by Paolo Gerbaudo, who you've heard about already in the introduction. Paolo, thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, everybody.
So to get started, although the book is a general overview of a new organizational form, the digital party, which Paolo discusses in length in his book, you draw examples from all over, but you keep coming back to Five Star Movement in Italy. And this seems to be, to me, for good reason. It's probably the most ideal typical digital party to date. Maybe you can agree or disagree with that. But I'd actually like to get started talking about Italy, mainly because it's been a little while since we caught up with what's going on there. And long-time listeners will know that kind of one of the starting points of this podcast or main theses is that Italy has in some way been a sort of negative innovator for a long time now. A lot of global political trends actually were started off in Italy. For those wanting to know more about this sort of discussion, you should check out episode 30, in which we previewed the recent Italian elections with David Broder, but also discussed in much longer terms the recent Italian history. So, Paolo, to get started, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Senso Comune that you're involved in. A past guest of ours, Thomas Fazzi, is also involved. And I reckon that the four of us probably have kind of some shared dispositions with Senso Comune. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I mean, Senso Comune is a movement that has been developing in recent years in Italy. I mean, it started very much as a think tank with different people. I mean, Thomas I, Samuele, Tommaso, Olympia, many other people who were basically concerned about the fact that the left in Italy was perhaps the most failing left in the entire kind of West, perhaps, in the sense that we have gone through a number of very heavy defeats in recent years, and there's seemingly no way out of that. And that is for a series of very important reasons that are present in Italy, perhaps in the most extreme way, but are more general issues that affect the left globally. They have to do with the third way transformation of the left, the way in which the left has tried to adopt a kind of middle-class strategy, the way in which it has adopted neoliberal policies. And the group started very much as a kind of intellectual media activism group, working on that. But then we have since then grown into basically a campaigning movement. We work on different campaigns for the nationalization of public services. We are now going to launch a campaign for on jobs, on the right of people to jobs and public jobs in particular. we think they are all very important issues for the left, yet they are issues that the left in Italy especially has abandoned. And in so doing, it has opened up the terrain for challengers, for other actors, including the Five Star Movement, whose success, to a great extent, stems precisely from this void that has opened up in the political space, with no actor claiming the role of egalitarianism and emancipation and improvement of conditions for ordinary people.
That's really interesting. If I could just chase it up, this is Phil. Have you got any international connections, senso comune, or do you think that you potentially offer a model for other movements or political actors in other countries in Europe?
I mean, we have connections with, say, the new left populist wave, right? What is sometimes described as the new left populism. I mean, our model from the start has been Podemos in Spain. We are informed by Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Insoumise in France. We look with sympathy at Corbyn's Labour Party in Britain, and at various youth movements and youth media activist groups such as Novara Media in Britain. I mean, in a way, we think that this left populism is an attempt to renew the left project, right? And we think that Italy is perhaps the country where this necessity is more radically seen, precisely because of the depth and the extent of the betrayal of the left in Italy, the way in which it has become the most committed actor to the neoliberal project, to the point that the left in Italy was more neoliberal than Berlusconi was, even.
And it seems the most wedded to the European project as well, perhaps the most Europeanized left.
Completely, which is part of the equation, right? Which is part of the equation in the sense that the European Union has been one of the main levers of neoliberalism in Europe, and the left has been completely wedded in Italy to this project. And to this day, it continues to be. Even the so-called radical left, much of it is very uneasy when it comes to even just criticizing the European Union, where criticism of the EU is considered tantamount to chauvinism or nationalism, or at least whatever, a nostalgia going back to a nation state that can never be redeemed, as it were.
And it's interesting because precisely because of the sort of parties that are in power in Italy now, it seems that some of the right populists have been able to usurp some of the energy where the left should be. So I wanted to ask, what has Five Star been like in government, seeing as you discuss it so much in your book? They seem to have somewhat been usurped by Lega. I mean, Five Star got 32% of the vote and Lega 17%. And I think in polling, this has basically flipped around recently.
Yes, very much, very much. I mean, I think you sum up well the situation in the sense that, I mean, I'd say that there was much hope in this government, and still there is a lot of hope, one has to admit, for a start, precisely because of the failure of the previous government, of Partito Democratico, Matteo Renzi's government, which has continued very much with the third way policies. And it was a sort of, Matteo Renzi was a sort of Tony Blair, Italian Tony Blair, 20 years after. Right after expiry date, say, and because of that, at least there was some hope, some credit to this government that they had some promises of having been more about Keynesian policies to some extent, being more critical of the EU, providing some public services, some transfers to poor people. The famous reddito di cittadinanza or citizen income, which the Five Star Movement has proposed. But I say, I mean, now is basically 7 months or 8 months since the government was formed. The government was formed back in March last year. And we have seen that very much what this government promised to be a government of change. And it can already be said that it is a government of betrayal, in the sense that they promised them a bolder line vis-a-vis the EU, and they have very rapidly surrendered to the injunction coming from Brussels, especially in regards to deficit spending. They were initially promising to have 2.4 deficit, which is required in a country with such a high levels of unemployment as Italy. Now they backtracked and now they contented themselves with 2.04, which is quite ludicrous. And they are making some promises of social spending, which I think should be assessed with some nuance, shouldn't be ridiculed as much of the left often does with everything that Five-Star Movement does. For example, the citizen income is basically a transfer of around, we don't know how much exactly it will be, but perhaps around kind of 500 euros. And it will depend on the number of family members. It will depend on the level of income, whether somebody is completely unemployed or, but still, in Italy, basically, we don't have a job seekers allowance, right? We don't have a universal unemployment benefit as you would have in Britain. In Italy, unemployment benefits are highly conditional. This means that there are millions of people, literally, which have no safety net. I don't know, perhaps only Greece is in a similar situation in Europe.
Hi, Paolo, it's George here. I think this is really interesting, and I guess it raises a question about maybe the Italian context and how Five-Star Movement operate within that. Because we heard back in June of last year that Italy was to get the first Minister for Direct Democracy, and this is a Five-Star Movement proposal. They've also advocated various referenda, and Davide Casaleggio, a Five-Star Movement activist, suggested in future Parliament might become superfluous. So I guess what's the significance of the Minister for Direct Democracy in this kind of social context of Italy in 2018, 2019?
To date, they haven't been doing much. I think they are still much in a kind of phase of elaboration, of trying to understand what they want to do with that. Obviously, this ministry has to be seen as the manifestation of this long-standing commitment of the Five-Star Movement to the idea of a direct democracy, the idea that citizens should directly intervene in decisions and policy making, bypassing representatives that are deemed to be distortive of the democratic process. Right? And I think this kind of discourse needs to be understood from a critical perspective, in the sense that much of it is highly problematic and has been betrayed, but it bespeaks the fact that indeed many people are distrustful of political representatives, and they're distrustful for very good reasons, right? Because they've seen their political representatives basically betraying their mandate for years and years, and be in cahoots with corporations, in cahoots with vested interests of all sorts. Right. So I think there is a kernel of truth in this promise that perhaps needs to be reclaimed. And indeed, I think that there's some way in which referendum and other forms of plebiscitary democracy can deliver more democratic participation and more democratic engagement. Now saying this in Britain after Brexit, that has been highly criticized for being a sort of fake consultation, may sound strange, but indeed also the Brexit referendum in a way was perhaps more democratic than many other forms of democracy that are widely accepted. It was a way in which people could air discontent, in which one could really see what a large share of the British public was thinking about the EU and European integration policies.
If I could just jump in there, Paolo, is there any sense in which you think, how does the Italian left, or even Senso Comune, if you could tell us a bit about their position on the EU? Well, you've already told us, I suppose, about the position of the Italian left and its slavish adulation of the European Union, but how far you think the Italian population at large, the electorate at large, is still wedded to the EU? And how does Senso Comune approach the European Union? Would you support Quit Italy? I think that's the name of the equivalent for Brexit for Italy. It's Quit Italy, isn't it?
Yeah, Quit Italy. Yeah.
Quit Italy, yeah, that's it.
Snappier that way.
I think there is, in Italy, there is all this debate on sovranismo, I don't know if you have heard this term, is a term that is quite current in France, where they speak of sovereignism. Basically, the idea is that is in a way the equivalent of populism, right? In a way, journalists getting tired of saying populism all the time. Now they change into sovereigntism, right? So namely, the idea is that there is a new divide, not just left and right, but sovereigntist, that is defenders of national sovereignty vis-a-vis anti-sovereigntist or Europeanists, right? Which indeed really cuts across the left and right divide in interesting ways. So according to this definition, for example, Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his Eurocriticism would be considered sovereigntist, right? While Macron would be the perfect example instead of anti-sovereigntist. I mean, and we at Senso Comune think that that kind of divide is important, because indeed sovereignty is perhaps the master signifier of contemporary politics, has become the key issue in contemporary political contentions. Yet it can be problematic as a identity position, right? In a sense that ultimately sovereignty is a means to an end, not the end in and of itself, right? In the sense that I am a socialist, we are socialists, so we think that we should reclaim part of national sovereignty at least, because the non-sovereignty of the European sovereignty we have these days is a huge obstacle to socialist policies, right?
And do you think and specifically on the electorate, do you think the view of the Italian voter is changing at all with respect to the European Union?
Yeah, the interesting thing connecting with that is that, I mean, for us, basically, we think that the main problem is the euro, and the European Union is also a problem, and it should be, in a way, radically reformed, if not completely sidestepped by whatever, a new treaty, a new form of integration, perhaps a confederation rather than a federation, a more loose kind of cooperation agreement. Yet, I think that the Italian electorate, in a way, is thinks the contrary, in the sense that there was a recent poll according to which, if people were asked to vote today on the European Union, 56% would vote to leave the European Union. Yet, pretty much the contrary would happen if they were asked about the euro. 56% would vote to stay in the euro, right? While
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So people are very, very skeptical of the EU, and they were not like that all the time. If you go back 10 years ago, say before the crisis, Italy was one of the most Europhile countries in the entire EU. Approval rates for the EU were up to, according to Eurobarometer, whatever, 70% plus, 80%. And these days is one of the most Eurosceptical countries, and for very good reasons, because since we entered this process of integration, Italy has become poorer and poorer and poorer. And to a great extent, we think it has to do precisely with what this process of integration has meant for Italy, right? Mm-hmm. It has meant basically giving a lot of our industries and a lot of our economic activities over to Germany, and losing competitive power vis-a-vis other industries, and not having any means to actually rebalance the economy because of the loss of monetary sovereignty.
How would you explain just quickly before we move on to the next section, but how would you explain then the contradiction between support for the euro and hostility to the European Union?
The fact is that, I mean, the euro is really a trap, is a mousetrap, in the sense that if you think about all the savings of Italian people, right? I mean, in Italy, there was a very large middle class. These days, we have a large, highly eroded middle class, a sort of lumpen bourgeoisie, lumpen petit bourgeoisie, right? That is what all these middle class families have become. In a sense, their savings, Italy was one of the most saving-prone countries in the world, together with Japan, right? But these savings have been eroding through time. So people who still have savings in euros, obviously they're wary that if we leave the euro, their savings are going to, at least in the short term, they're going to lose value, right? So you're in a situation where it's a sort of lose-lose, in a sense that people know that they are stuck with a system they don't like, yet they perhaps don't want to make the hard choice, yet take the hard step required to rebalance the situation.
So, Paolo, this context of democratic deficit, of the sense of distance between politics and citizens, as well as these sort of contradictory attitudes trying to resolve it. You cite the contradiction of attitudes to the EU versus the euro in Italy, and there's many others. This is all very important context, I think, for coming on to discuss the main subject that we're here to discuss today, which is the question of digital parties, which is, you argue, a sort of new organizational form for political parties. You set this in a historical trajectory from the mass party of the 19th and 20th century through to the television party of the late 20th century to the digital party of today. This sort of digital party reflects an organizational model that private companies have adopted, moving towards more lightweight and outsourced models, and then even to a platform-based model, which you discuss. So I think Phil wanted to ask more specifically about what this organizational form entails.
Yes, I think there is an interesting parallel in history between economic organizational forms and political organizational forms, in the sense that if we look at the industrial period, the socialist and communist parties mirrored the forms of organization in the economy used by capitalist firms in many different respects. In a way, they absorbed the Taylorism, the efficiency-driven management forms developed by capitalist firms, and geared them towards ends of socialist policies, towards ends of popular organization and emancipation. I mean, obviously, at any historical time, political organizations need to adopt the best technologies and the best forms of management, for the very simple reason that if they don't do that, they don't stand a chance to fight against economic power, right? Which is ultimately one of the main missions of political parties.
But your argument is that they do something more than just use technologies, for example, in their external communications, right? That there's an internal restructuring of the party.
Yes, I mean, the digital party can be seen as a new instance of these technological and organizational transformation that we have seen in previous historical eras. In a sense that now, for a long time, it looked as if political parties were the most reluctant actors to change, to technological change. That is, while the economy has been changing dramatically in recent years, while the forms of consumption, the forms of labor have been changing dramatically as a consequence of digital technology, often when we looked at parties, it looked as if parties were still pretty much the same as they were in the 20th century, right? If not the 19th century. But there is this new generation of parties, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, Podemos in Spain, France Insoumise in France, organizations such as Momentum, that have instead made a very significant innovation in the way in which they are organized, which to a great extent mirrors the model of the Silicon Valley economy, right? Of the digital economy. These organizations are adopting lean management techniques. They are creating discussion platforms which look very much like social media platforms, where people can create an account and can participate in discussions and deliberations. There are instant polls that look in a way like reactions on social media, where people are voting by liking things, by upvoting or downvoting. That is, these parties are integrating in the political sphere a number of practices that have become already current in our society and in our economic system. In so doing, they are updating the party form to the digital era.
So what could you tell us just briefly a little bit, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, what the sort of platforms are that these platform parties, or to use your term, digital parties, use? What is their means of engaging their members, which is meant to be distinct from past modes of political organization?
For example, in the case of the Five-Star Movement, they have a platform called Rousseau, after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Genevian political philosopher, where you can create an account. It goes through a process of verification and so on and so forth. Then there's a number of options. You can, for example, you can propose a law to be discussed, to be tabled in the regional assembly or in the national assembly or in the European Parliament. People can comment on that, or you can comment on proposals tabled in different assemblies, or you can vote participate in different referenda, online referenda on a number of issues. One of the most famous occasions in the Five Star Movement has been referenda to expel members accused of having breached party guidelines, a sort of guillotine referendum, a kind of Jesus or Barabbas referendum. Do you want to expel this guy? I mean, almost invariably, not almost invariably, these referenda have ended with an approval for the expulsion. Right?
That's something that you actually point out in the book, that a lot of these internal referenda end up with really kind of landslide victories for the proposition.
Yes. In the case of the Five Star Movement, there have been around 40 consultations, and only in 2 instances there have been rank-and-file rebellions, successful rank-and-file rebellions. One case was a consultation regarding the illegal migration crime that was discussed, whose elimination was discussed in Parliament. Casaleggio and Grillo, they adopted a very kind of realist, in quote, anti-migration line. But in fact, the base was more, say, to the left on civil rights than they were. So it ultimately overwhelmingly voted in favor of the elimination of this crime. Similarly, in the case of Podemos, we've seen similar phenomena. For example, there's been a famous referendum recently after the Galapagar case. I think the listeners perhaps have heard about this case. That is last May or June, Pablo Iglesias and his partner and political and sentimental partner, Irene Montero, were heavily criticized on the media because they purchased a house, a quite posh house in Galapagar, in the outskirts of Madrid. And the thing was criticized because it seemed to go against their promise, right, of a politics of common people, ordinary people, different from the kind of posh politics of the past. So in order to reinforce their position and to silence criticism, they had this sort of recall referendum on themselves. They themselves called the recall referendum, and 68% of the people voted for them to stay. But it was quite a low share of votes compared to many other referenda. I mean, as I say in the book, most of these referenda end up with 80+% shares, majorities in favor of the leadership. So the fact that 32% of people voted against them was already quite a significant sign of discontent of the base towards their leadership.
Interesting. So this raises one of the perhaps key questions in this area, which I think is, what's the effect, do you think, of these digital parties on party members, and this question of who has power within the party? You talk about, or people often talk about, this idea of disintermediation. So you in the book talk about decentralization of access goes with greater centralization of control. Could you unpack this a little bit? What's really going on here? Do these parties decentralize, or do they, and give power back to the people, or do they centralize power?
Yes, I think it's, when we try to explain this new model, it's always useful to compare it with previous models, and in particular with the model of the mass party, which ultimately is the template of most socialist and communist party we are familiar with, which was pretty much a multi-tier representation system, right? Where you would have a local structure called a cell or a section, then organize a regional level, and then moving up and up with a delegate democracy, sometimes a multi-level delegate democracy, where people would elect other people, and elected people would in turn elect other people, right? In this case, instead, the promise, at least on paper, is to completely disintermediate this. Namely, the idea that people can elect directly the secretary, the treasurer, the committee of guarantee. They can directly participate in policy discussion. All things that before were not available to the membership, right? I mean, in a sense that before you would elect a delegate, which would sit in the National Assembly or in the party conference, and in the party conference, this person would then go on to elect the top offices of the party, right? So the interesting thing here is that people have grown suspicious of these levels of intermediation, and perhaps they're right to do so, because with the change in social conditions, with also the lower political participation of people, often these intermediate levels of the party, these cadres of the party, have become, in a way, not responsive to the base anymore, right? They have become autonomous and self-serving, right? So what happens there is a sort of plebiscitary transformation of the party, which is quite paradoxical in a sense that on the one hand, you can say that the base is more empowered. That is why in the book I talk about a super base, in the sense that it is assigned a number of choices, a number of decisions that before it didn't have, that before were assigned instead to elected officials who in turn decided, in a way were sort of super delegates, right, decided for people. While now ordinary members are, at least on paper, given these decisions. Yet this goes hand in hand with a strengthening of the center, right? This is something that libertarians who often talk about leaderlessness or digital technology as leading to a sort of digital anarchism often overlook, namely the fact that often giving more power to rank and file members goes hand in hand with more power to the very center of the party, to the leadership, which is why in the book I talk of the hyper leader.
Yeah, I love how you explain out this contradiction, because it was something that hadn't really occurred to me exactly what troubled me a little bit about these digital parties. And what's interesting is that through the means of the platform, it seems to give power to the people. And yet, you write, the platform is never neutral. This is something that everybody who uses Facebook knows, that, you know, everybody complains about the Facebook algorithm, right? There's someone still controlling how the platform works. And I guess that's analogous to what's happening in digital parties. Is that right?
Completely. In the sense that on the one hand, you have this sort of libertarian promise, the idea that you do away with all the hierarchies, all forms of mediation, all forms of control, all the bureaucracy, right? All these relics of the past, or at least what they are perceived to be the relics of the past. And you are in this situation in which people can directly make decisions. Yet this is quite obviously a lie, an illusion, in the sense that ultimately there is still a form of mediation which is not personalized, which doesn't go through an apparatus or through apparatchiks, right? But it goes through the algorithm and through the platform. And as any coder knows, the code always involves arbitrary decisions about the choices that people can make, about the way in which data is aggregated, the way in which questions are formulated. For example, this is something that already Robert Michels, the theorist of the party, of the mass party, back at the beginning of the 20th century, discussed the fact that you can manipulate people's decisions simply by the way in which you order questions, right? For example, if you have a multi-option consultation, the mere fact that you position a question in the first place and another one in the second place makes the first option more likely to be chosen by people, right?
Which is always the critique of plebiscitarianism, right?
Yes.
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 This is Ben. Let's
Hi,
just
Ben.
go. Hi. And let's just go back to this question in terms of digital parties. In terms of what we have in terms of concrete examples, movements of digital parties, what exactly is the social base of these parties? Is there a distinct social base? I think in the book, you talk about two factors connecting this specific base and often involving quite young people. One is hyper-connected in the sense of people who have a lot of access to internet and spend a lot of time on social media. And second of all, the sort of exploited or hyper-exploited nature of these people in the sense they're sort of millennials, young, having a lack of opportunities, being some of the sort of were victims of the economic crisis and kind of the political and economic stasis that's taken hold in many countries.
Yes. I talk about, I use this notion of connected outsiders, right? Which highlight the paradox many people live in these days, right? The fact that on the one hand, they have this high level of connectivity, high access to kind of cultural goods, to knowledge, to education. But at the same time, young people tend to be some of the most underprivileged in present economic conditions. They often suffer more difficult economic conditions than their parents, than older people. And you see that across many of these parties. Podemos vote was very young, was very high in internet connectivity. To some extent also is the case with the Five-Star Movement. Also less digital, more traditional parties that have gone through renewal, such as Labour, display similar tendencies in terms of their socio-demographics of support. France Insoumise vote has also been very young. Then, you have to say that the base of support is quite diversified, right? In the sense that these connected outsiders are the bulk of support, but then you also have, for example, unemployed people. You also have people who are older in age. To some extent, this has always happened with political parties. Even back in the days in the industrial era, for example, the Communist Party in France or in Italy, they also, for example,
I'm still coming here. It's like a point. What I think is actually something which has also been quite interesting is over here in Brazil, where we've had the rise of Bolsonaro, who's also had quite a big support base among young people, actually. And one of the things is that the hyper-connected youth, and at least a significant element of them, ended up voting for him. So I think it's just worth pointing out that hyper-connectivity and the sort of access to these spaces doesn't necessarily translate to any progressive politics.
Yes, completely. I'd say that, in the case of these movements, it connects to progressive politics because these people are also, these hyper-connected people are also hyper-exploited, right? So most of the electorate of these parties stands at a cross point between these two categories, right? So they are more concerned about social spending, about public services, about unemployment, and all these things. Then obviously there is not at all, how do you say, a correlation necessarily between hyperconnectivity and progressive politics, right? I think it is quite clear. But perhaps there is a strong predictive element in youth vote, right? Across many parties that we are seeing in recent years for a very simple reason, not because people were more or are younger tend to vote more for the left, but because contemporary youth is more fucked, is more screwed than older people, right?
Yeah. I just want to make one point. In terms of this, do you think, in terms of the sort of hyperconnectivity as a social base, and this sort of exploited demographic, do you think there's a possibility for a sort of more long-term sort of organization of these people through this platform party, or is it always going to remain sort of a loose affiliation?
One of the interesting things that perhaps also refers to the previous question is that in terms of membership, the main novelty of these parties is that they make it very easy for people to become members. So before, in order to become a member of the party, you had to meet a number of conditions. In a radical ultra-left party, you also perhaps had to go through an interview process. But at least in most parties, you have to pay dues, right? Every year you have to pay whatever, 50, 60, 70. Perhaps you even had to pay once every month or every 2 months, right? While with these parties, mostly the sign-up process is free. And that's one key similarity with social media. Namely, you just need to, for example, in the case of the France Insoumise, you just need to write your email and your name and to push the button, I support, je soutiens. So this is very interesting because basically it radically lowers the barrier between sympathizer and full-on member. So this has, I think, a very, very strong potential to pull in many people who have for a long time been marginalized from politics, from the political process, mainly because they felt that being a member of an organization was something very bureaucratic, very gray, very complex. While now, I think it is only a good thing that becoming a member becomes something easy, right? Then the problem, though, is that there is a risk that many of these people become then dormant members. And you indeed see that in consultations where often the participation rate is around 20% of people, which is quite disappointing. So there is a risk of a sort of a passive democracy in which people become members, are at least formally integrated, but then functionally they're not really integrated. They participate very little, and mostly they participate in more plebiscitary consultations, where it is ultimately easier to participate. Right?
Which is a sort of irony of the digital party, isn't it? That it proposes that people will be more engaged, more active, more involved in politics, and at the same time it maybe suggests a model which is quite passive, albeit it does bring in new masses into party organizations which would have been completely distant from it, maybe even apathetic beforehand. And I think I want to use this opportunity to maybe segue to a little bit of the deeper context, the deeper socio-political context, which gives rise to the digital party and informs the digital party's critique of past modes of organization. George has already mentioned, as we talked about, the notion of disintermediation, the idea that the party cadres and the bureaucracy get removed from the party and you get the, as you call it, Paolo, the super base, and then you get the leader, and there's a kind of gulf in between. I guess if we want to tie this to a kind of more longer term critique amongst progressive movements, which is the critique of bureaucracy. Is there a way of understanding this as a sort of a critique of Stalinism gone too far, that reacting against the sort of Stalinist party of the 20th century, this very heavy, solid organization where individual members had very little autonomy, you've gone all the way to the other side and done away with any sort of stratifications, any structures, any hierarchy towards a supposedly horizontalist model? Doesn't that bring with it certain problems, as you've already hinted at, I guess, that you lose out any form of representation within the party?
Yes, I do agree with this. I think that when approaching the digital party from a normative perspective, we need to have a kind of nuanced approach where we basically identify the good element of innovation. There is, I think, there are a lot of good things in the fact that people are involved directly in important consultations. For example, about party policy, about important dilemma decisions. For example, whether a party should enter government in a coalition, or which position a party should take on an important decision. Yet at the same time, there is a risk of a lack of integration, right, in the party process, because people don't feel that they are structured in something more meaningful. And that is where also more traditional forms of participation in local activities, in face-to-face meetings, continues to be very important. So I think that there is an element, a destructive element of this party model that I think should be reclaimed from progressive movements. And I think that all parties will need to take heed of some of the lessons. Yet there is a lot left to be transformed and changed in this party model. Indeed, exaggerated criticism of bureaucracy, I think, is problematic, because parties need bureaucracies in order to operate efficiently and democratically.
Which is a point that often gets lost, right? That bureaucracy is seen as completely inimical to democracy. But I think as we want to come on to discuss the notion of participation, which is identified with ipso facto with democracy, that the digital party proposes, depends on a very individualistic sort of form of participation. The notion of participation in a banal sense is kind of a sort of universal positive, right? It's the active citizen being engaged in politics. Who's against that, right? We're all in favor of that. But the digital party seems to propose something a little bit beyond that rather than the party representing collective categories such as workers or women or, having modes of representation or strata of representation through local branches and so on, all you have is just individuals, atomized individuals representing themselves through the platform. So it's just the kind of Facebook model, and you don't really end up with aggregated collectivities. So it's quite an individualistic proposition, isn't it?
Yes, to a great extent it is. And the risk also is that you have an aristocracy of participation developing there, in a sense that there tend to be few people who have actually the time to engage in participating in meaningful and in-depth discussions. For example, discussions on policy. Not everyone has the time or the knowledge, the expertise to engage in these discussions. Therefore, there is a risk that you have new forms of inequality that are emerging within these parties as a consequence of that. So this is problematic in a sense. Participation, if participation becomes an end in and of itself, this is dangerous for democracy, in the sense that there is a sort of trade-off between participation and representation. You can end up having a very participatory system that however, is not representative of the feelings of party members.
Just to come in here, I think this is one of the more interesting points that you made in your book was about the role of leadership in this particular party form. I think it's quite clear right now in terms of what you identify as the sort of television party or the previous model of a mass party structure. There was a sort of cadre system to the party. There was a rank that could fill up leadership positions. Now what you're really seeing is in the current age is the reliance on the charismatic leader who's kind of at a distance from any sort of formal bureaucratic structure. This leader, in effect, often becomes sort of seen as a sort of removed from the party and becomes just a spokesperson to amplify the issues of the base or whatever is considered the sort of guiding sentiment of the time. So in many respects, as the charismatic leadership has taken this role, it's in effect a sign of the decay of the sort of mass political party as a category. And I think it's both a weakness and an interesting thing in the sense that could there be a sort of Bernie Sanders moment without Bernie Sanders on the progressive side? But on the other side, you have something like Bolsonaro rising up as a figure in which a leader which comes to the fore as amplifying these voices too, but this sort of unpredictability and rely on the sort of personalized style of leadership makes for some very dangerous political conjunctures. So I think in end, what I'm quite interested in this, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this, is how in our current age, in some respects, if we consider the mass political party as an achievement of modernity, neoliberalism, for all its claims to be a more modern and efficient style of governance, has actually ended up undermining one of these structures and opening the way to what even might be pre-modern styles of leadership in terms of personal networks and this guy standing outside of any formal accountability measures. What do you think of this?
Yes, I think that it bespeaks, this emerging party form bespeaks a lot of the neoliberal spirit and its distrust of collective organizations. I mean, unfortunately, we need to accept, though from a normative perspective, it's problematic for us, the fact that people these days are very suspicious of collective organizations. And they lend more trust to charismatic figures, for example, to Jeremy Corbyn or to Bernie Sanders. Also because, interestingly, these figures have often been fighting with their own parties. We know that Jeremy Corbyn has gone through a very prolonged fight with the apparatus of the Labour Party that was still very much dominated by Blairite figures. And the same has happened with Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party in the US. Right? So there are very good reasons why these days people are distrustful of bureaucratic organizations and are more trustful towards charismatic leaders. The point is what this is leading to. I mean, Gramsci said that when discussing the modern prince, the political party as the modern prince, that in a way personal leadership was something of the past, that we're now in a technological era where the only feasible mode of political power was collective organization, namely the political party. Yet he interestingly also said that there were some conditions in which personal leadership, the leadership of the condottiere, may still play a role. And these were phases of emergency, phases of organic crisis, where you basically still need a kind of charismatic leader whose role ultimately, from a long-term perspective, is the one of refounding the collective organization. Is a sort of transitional figure who is there in order to set the foundation for a new organization to emerge. And I think from a positive perspective, this is the way in which we need to look at this charismatic leadership. Namely, there is a role, there is a function for these charismatic leaders, but it is a transitional function. I mean, these leaders should be there to reestablish a viable form of collective organization that is not reducible to their own personality, that can then basically follow on what they have constructed.
So, would you say, I guess, to kind of to focus it down a little bit, that we have this movement from Berlusconi, who's one of the key figures of this podcast, being the classic TV, I guess, the classic TV politician, to Beppe Grillo, who's the classic kind of digital politician. Is this too simple?
No, completely. We see some similarities between, for example, Beppe Grillo and Berlusconi, right? I mean, the fact that there is an element of the society of the spectacle in these leaders, and indeed, Grillo is a figure that made the transition from being a TV celebrity to becoming an internet celebrity. And if you look at figures such as Salvini and Bolsonaro, they very much owe their leadership to their ability to play the game of the society of the spectacle, right? Being there, always present for the public, hugging babies, making ludicrous statements on whatever topic. And the same goes also for progressive figures such as Mélenchon and Sanders. And these people are successful because they are able to be performative actors. And I think we need to accept that that is necessary in present conditions, namely that the people are looking for that. That is the only way in these days that we can develop that sentimental connection between the people and the party, to use the famous expression of Antonio Gramsci. So thereby the charismatic leader becomes the necessary vehicle for this affective link between the electorate and the party. However, obviously, there are some serious dangers to this process and to this phenomenon that need to be considered and that need, in a way, to be overcome. But they need to be overcome through a Hegelian moment, right, where we start dealing with the present situation, and only later we try to erect a new organizational structure on the ruins of the old system, as it were.
A kind of Aufhebung, if you
exactly,
if you will.
Exactly. So you see, in the same answer, you have both bunga bunga and Aufhebung.
Perfect. That's what we wanted. That's what we're leading up towards.
It's pretty much the thesis.
So you've made the case that there's the possibility or the desirability that this new generation of charismatic figures, at least on the left, point towards a transition to, I suppose, a repoliticization and the reformation of more inclusive and collaborative political structures. So is your overall assessment of this new type of politics, is it positive or negative? And what are the prospects for this model of politics at the end of history?
Yes, I mean, it is positive in the sense that these parties are facing up to the challenge of creating new structures in the digital era that can have the same level of efficiency than digital corporations have, or a similar level of efficiency. And I think if we want to be successful, we need to realize that legitimacy is one thing efficiency is another thing, and the two things need to have their place, right? They need both to have their importance. Too often, movements have thought that it was enough for them to be completely democratic. Sometimes, though, this sometimes went at the expense of their efficacy. So, in terms of efficacy, I think it is clearly demonstrated that these parties, because of this organizational model, they've been very efficient. They've managed to grow very fast to become parties in government, as is the case with the 5-Star and partly with Podemos, though it is supporting externally the government of Sanchez in Spain. The question, though, is how they will evolve from this embryonic form and overcome some of the most evident problems they have. And the most evident problems have to do mainly with the fact that there is a lot of betrayal of the promise they make at face value, the promise of an extended democracy, while for the most, what they are actually delivering is a sort of top-down democracy, is a reactive democracy, is a quantitative democracy, where mostly people can only basically say like or love or unlike to posts, to messages that have already been packaged and manufactured by the top, with very little room for bottom-up intervention, right? So this calls for a very serious rethinking of this template. But my contention is that we should work with this template, right? That we should not reject it, but we should accept it as the game in town, and we should work with it.
Excellent, Paolo. That's all to be found in The Digital Party, Political Organization and Online Democracy. It's out on Pluto Press now. And I think it's a very important book because it does start to sketch out what is still something which is quite embryonic, as Paolo has just described, but which we will no doubt be seeing more popping up in various different countries around the world and perhaps intensifying there where they already exist. Paolo, thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Thanks very much to you all.
All right, so this is just a little chat between the four of us to pick out some of the key themes that were discussed there. So firstly on leadership, Ben, you wanted to make a point on this.
Well, I think we need to... I think the rise of the charismatic leader in this particular party form bears some more points than we had just elaborated in our discussion there. I think, for one, I think the decline of the mass political party is a real tragedy. These things took quite a while to get going, and even if they became moribund and pathetic, as in the case of perhaps the first modern mass political party, the German Social Democratic Party, the loss of this form leaves so many social wounds that are dangerous going forward. And I think this rise of charismatic leadership is particularly worth noting when we start speaking about the so-called rise of the new right or populist right, whatever you want to call them. I think, for instance, as some have argued, there's particular digital nature with, say, Bolsonaro, for instance, and how he addresses his followers directly through Facebook Live and eschews traditional media. So in some senses, the ways of traditional accountability and having to deal with some of these sort of institutions of liberal democracy that can mediate is being hampered with the decline of the mass party by figures who don't really respect this, who have the technologies to bypass it. And I think
I'm not sure. Sorry,
I'm taking that's one sort of argument you can make. But I think what's actually more interesting than that argument is when basically, if you have a party infrastructure behind you, you have a cadre, you have some sort of group that can fill the ranks if you take power of a government. When you don't, who fills the ranks? And what you're seeing is these really strange piecemeal coalitions of all and sundry of, for instance, in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, these absolute weirdos, and in some cases, family networks. So you're seeing other forms of sort of networks that are, or connections that are not located within sort of liberal democratic institutional frameworks being used to desperately fill up governmental positions and govern because of a lack of any political capacity. And I think while we haven't seen so much what will happen if a left party takes power and if they lack the cadre capacity, what they will do about this is the right-wing phenomenon, and it leads to some, at the very least, very bizarre political events.
I think
the second point you make, Ben, is more relevant maybe than the first. I don't have too much of a problem with the direct communication from a party leader to the masses or to its base, because at the end of the day, that is at least an improvement on the limitations of the hollowed out cartel party of the television age, where party leaders were incredibly dependent on access to the media gatekeepers to communicate to the people. So you saw this with a figure like Tony Blair getting close to Rupert Murdoch. If that means that if the new development of using social media to communicate with people is done more directly and doesn't depend on media gatekeepers, I don't think that's too much of a problem. The novel aspect, anyway, is not so much the use of external communications, as we discussed at the beginning of the episode, but using digital technologies internally in the organization of the party.
Oh, no, for sure. I don't disagree with you. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But what it is a major shift in terms of how the basic functioning of democracy works, in the sense of how it's supposed to work. And this is what we see in part with things like knobs, is people panicking because suddenly the traditional gatekeepers are no longer relevant.
But it's a phony, I think the point is it's a phony proximity. Because you can watch someone on Facebook or follow their Twitter doesn't mean that you're in any meaningful way closer to power or have greater control over the political process. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's precisely because you don't have control, because you don't have these intermediary layers, political structures, social structures that connect you to power, that the phony proximity, you get this sense of phony proximity by being able to directly connect with a leader, whether it's Bolsonaro or Trump, through social media. I think the point also that Paolo made, though, is that this is a phenomenon that crosses parties, not just those on the right, but also is charismatic, these kind of charismatic digital leadership on the left. And also I think it's important because the point is, and this builds on what Ben was saying, that there's no way for society to effectively imprint its interests into the state. And that seems to me very dangerous, that if society, civil society, social movements, political movements have no way in which they can embed or capture the state, then it means effectively that there's no way for social interests to be expressed, and that's very dangerous. And I think it may also, it reinforces tendencies such as Bolsonaro's appointment of such a large swathe of military figures, precisely because like Ben said, there's no cadre, there's no membership of a political party by which you can funnel people from society into the state.
Well, I mean, what you're missing is a notion of, I guess, representation. And I thought that was something that Paolo talked about really interestingly, that you move to participation, or you move to this particularistic kind of like reflection of yourself rather than a representation.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is, of course, I mean, one question which we didn't get onto, which has literally just come to me, and I sort of wish that I'd asked it, is what really explains the rise of these parties? Is it their technological innovation? Is it the changing kind of social structures of mainly Western European societies? Or is it a response to an absence of participation, or a moral panic around apathy, or some idea of we just need to get people involved in politics? So the easiest way to do this is to dismantle ideas of representation and replace them with more disintermediated closer relationship with
technocratic
political.
Neoliberalism has led to the hollowing out of political parties, the reign of the market, the displacement of politics or collective will, or a sense of conscious social direction and purpose. All of that has contributed to it and is expressed in all the various ways that you suggested, George.
The things that Phil and Ben have just critiqued are things that apply to the hollowed out cartel party of the late 20th century, the sort of neoliberal politics. The fact that sort of newly created parties have to bring in all sorts of weirdos into government, or bring in military figures into government because there's no party cadre, there's no established leadership, there's no organization, established political structures. That's something which is not such new news. I think the way to understand the digital party is something else. It's that it actually proposes to re-democratize things. It's filling in the party. It's filling in a hollowed out party. And at least I think we have to not treat it too cynically as just a maneuver for a new charismatic form of leadership with, sheeple following it on Facebook. I think it does propose a more substantial form of engagement from party members. So I think Paolo.
That's not what Paolo was saying at all. He was saying he was more ambivalent about it. He's saying he hopes, he hopes it's going to be a transitional form and that we'll go through this kind of era of new charismatic leaders. But I mean, he doesn't suggest that there's a new activism on the part of membership. Quite the opposite. Everything that he was saying was that it leads to greater withdrawal and apathy. All you can do is vote in these stunts which are engineered by the leadership, direct democracy. You can like things on social media and so on, but it's not a kind of sustained, engaged and structured process of participation.
I mean, I think part of this is, at least in the sort of left renewal sense, which is this has been a form of politics, is that normally when you have a sort of left upsurge or a new left party or sort of left wave, it traditionally followed, say, for instance, a period of union militancy or social unrest, which produces a set of institutions and organizations which then seek to secure their interests through political power. And now what we've seen is, if you wanted to be very banal about it, in terms of the standard narrative, all these sort of leaderless protests which have failed to produce the same sort of institutional representation through their militancy or protests as previously done. Now what you're seeing is that this is in the absence of having a way of being involved. This is how people can simulate involvement or bring people in, because people already just cannot see a sort of more hierarchical or more standard way of associational forms as something which is possible in the current age. I think for a lot of people our age, we have never been in any sort of movement or been proximate to a movement where you've had that experience of having to be accountable and having to operate in a hierarchy as a political militant where you get deployed.
Right. I think it ends up reflecting, you get these protests like the movement of the squares in Spain, and then it takes a party form, but instead of actually forming a mass party, it ends up creating an organizational form which reflects exactly the problems of movementism, which is that people get burnt out. It depends very much on your own individualized engagement without any structures to maintain continuity over time when that flourish of enthusiasm has later on evaporated.
Yeah, exactly.
So the digital party ends up very evanescent.
I mean, in that sense, at its best, what it can do is seek to renew or give rise to something which could perhaps get people more involved on a sustained basis. But I think the experience that most people have when they try to get involved in an organization, at least in the United States or the UK or countries of this type, is when you go to a meeting and you feel strongly about an issue, it's like you have to volunteer your time and you have to come up with what people should be doing, rather than hey, you tell me what to do. And that's kind of this sort of entrepreneurial model of activism, which is sort of much part of digital branding, that
Absolutely.
You have to cultivating identity through the cultivation of self, rather than having something which is anonymous and not for public consumption, but is building something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the vicissitudes of the new digital economy brought into politics, and that's really bad because, as we discussed in the Entrepreneurs episode, there's a hell of a lot of problems with that. In fact, there's some really creepy similarities with it, actually. The entrepreneurial model of the economy depends on these great charismatic leader figures which carry society forward through their own genius. And the political form of that, the digital party, seems to reflect that almost uncannily.
There's also this idea on the left is that behind everybody who cares deeply about an issue, there's a potential mega activist there. All you have to do is just be the best self you can possibly be, and suddenly that will make you a great activist, which is kind of what people really think. And a lot of it's just really talking about yourself as a way of militancy.
I was going to make a point about a podcast being like a political party, but I'm not going to do it. It was stupid.
Political party.
Do we all admit Alex is our great leader?
Oh yeah, he's the anti-charismatic leader of the podcast.
So he's kind of like
Alex is trying. He is anti-charismatic. That's a good thing because he's trying to re-establish bureaucratic authority and procedure in institutions. And for that, we should all respect him.
So Alex is just a desperate barbarian.
Alex is not
desperate barbarian.
Alex is not a digital demagogue.
No, I think
come into my iron cage.
That was a good one. You have
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
That was great.
That's creepy.
Okay. All right. Let's finish. I'm just gonna say something.